Hello and welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast. You're listening to Helen Bennett, LLG's Executive Director of Policy and Governance, and Dennis Hall, LLG Bulletin Editor.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Dennis. Now, before we start, I just want to say thank you to those in the membership who have already taken the time to complete our survey on sanctions and conduct, which will inform our response to the government. There is still plenty of time to give us your views, and I would urge you all to do so, because whatever the government decides will most definitely affect us all in our professional life. The other big headline is, of course, the white paper on local authority reorganisation and devolution. We have already had a number of sessions on this, and this week it's the turn of the Midlands regional area. So try and join us on Wednesday if you can. Now, Dennis, quite a bit of interesting coverage in the bulletin this week. What are we starting with?
Well, yes, we're going to start with these proposals for changes to the GR rules concerning infrastructure plans. Campaigners will be blocked from excessive legal challenges to planning decisions for major infrastructure projects, including airports, railways, and nuclear power stations, as part of the government's drive for economic growth. High Court judges will be given the power to rule that judicial reviews on nationally significant projects that they regard as totally without merit will not go forward and will be unable to go to appeal. Keir Starmer said the change would take the brakes off Britain before reforming the planning system, sending a message to business to build more national infrastructure as ministers desperately pursue opportunities to improve the economy. For too long, blockers have had the upper hand in legal challenges, using our court processes to frustrate growth, he said. And he went on, we're putting an end to this challenge culture by taking on the NIMBYs and a broken system that has slowed down our progress as a nation. Now, it's one of a range of measures being considered by the government as part of an all-encompassing dash for growth, which has caused alarm among environmental groups. And some environmentalists have expressed unease with the government's drive to curtail legal challenges to infrastructure projects, of which they have promised to deliver 150 during the course of this Parliament. Now, official figures show that 58% of all ministerial decisions on major infrastructure projects taken since 2012 were taken to court, which the government said caused years of delay and added hundreds of millions of cost to projects.
Well, I know, Dennis, that Charles Banner, he led an independent review last year into legal challenges against nationally significant infrastructure projects. And he said that the plan would weed out the worst offenders by reducing the number of spurious challenges available from 3 to 1. And he continued that there's a clear case for streamlining judicial reviews on consenting decisions for nationally significant infrastructure projects, given that delays to these projects cause real detriment to the public interest. He added, in particular, reducing the number of permission attempts to 1 for truly hopeless cases should weed out the worst offenders without risking inadvertent delays because judges choose to err on the side of caution.
Well, yes, indeed. And under the new proposals, the current first attempt, as you know, known as the paper permission stage, will be scrapped. Primary legislation will be changed so that where a judge in an oral hearing at the High Court deems the case totally without merit, it will not be possible to ask the Court of Appeal to reconsider it. A request to appeal second attempt will be allowed for other cases. Now, government officials said the approach would ensure access to justice and protection against genuine issues of propriety, while pushing back against a challenge culture where small pressure groups use the courts to obstruct decisions taken in the national interest. Helen.
Well, there really does seem to be a full-scale shake-up of the planning system in this country. Interestingly, I was listening to the plans in respect to the proposed expansion of Heathrow Airport, and I can't remember the minister who was speaking to it, but they were clear that in order to give effect to the expansion within the time frame contemplated, and I believe that was 10 years, then these changes to the planning system were absolutely necessary. So there does seem to be an understanding that by hook or by crook, changes to the planning system are going to happen. Now, in other news, the influential Public Accounts Committee has warned of an over-reliance on the use of temporary accommodation due to in part a dwindling and increasingly costly housing stock, and that's taken from its report Tackling Homelessness. The committee found that record homelessness levels were placing local authority finances under unsustainable pressure. It went on to say, quote, "We are greatly concerned that homelessness levels are at their highest since records began. The latest data shows that 123,000 households in England were being housed in temporary accommodation as at June 2024, and that providing temporary accommodation cost local authorities over 1.6 billion in the year 22 to 23. Data published after their evidence session suggested that the cost in 23-24 rose to around 2.1 billion. So faced with the crisis situation, local authorities are less and less able to spend funding on homelessness prevention, even funding that is normally intended for this purpose."
Well, indeed, and I see, Helen, that the Ministry have stated that it is committed to producing a long-term housing strategy early in 2025 that will focus on both supply and quality. And the Ministry suggests that the strategy would set out a range of actions across the supply chain on issues such as skills, planning, working with developers, breaking down barriers to development, and they also include building up the role of SMEs, reforms to social housing, the new Towns Task Force, building up the capacity of local planning authorities to work through cases faster, which we of course welcome, and dealing with the barriers that hold back stalled sites.
Yeah, that's right. And in its written submission, the National Housing Federation suggested that the government's plans for tackling homelessness should reflect the essential role that supported housing plays in enabling independence and providing good quality homes appropriate to need and reducing reliance on public services. And it suggested that supported housing helps 500,000 people in the community, with around 75% of that delivered by housing associations, of course. And the National Housing Federation conducted research which found that were it not for supported housing, 41,000 more people would be homeless and 30,000 would be at risk of homelessness. Now let's turn to the criminal courts, Dennis, and the issue of computer evidence, which must surely, I think, become more important as we move towards AI. But what's the latest on that?
Well, yes, precisely. The role of computer evidence in criminal cases is to be examined to prevent future miscarriages following the wrongful convictions of sub-postmasters in the Post Office Horizon scandal. The Ministry of Justice has announced a call for evidence on how evidence derived from IT systems should be treated in criminal trials. Currently, there is a presumption that computers work correctly, and unless there is evidence to the contrary, any evidence generated by software is accurate. Now, the wrongful convictions of hundreds of innocent sub-postmasters in the Post Office Horizon scandal highlighted the limitations of such a presumption, the government said. The MOJ said faults in the Post Office's accounting software system proved the fallibility of digital evidence and the potential for devastating miscarriages of justice if evidence is not thoroughly interrogated. The expert review aims to build on government efforts to restore public confidence in policing and in the criminal justice system generally. Now, the 12-week call for evidence asks for views from across the justice system and beyond on the presumption that computers always work correctly, as well as how computer evidence should be defined and what could fall into scope of any change to the law.
Well, that's right. And Justice Minister Sarah Sackman, Casey, said, and I quote, "We must learn the lessons of the Post Office scandal. A blanket, no questions asked acceptance of the accuracy of digital evidence can have a devastating impact on people's lives." And of course, we saw that, didn't we, Dennis, in the Post Office scandal?
Indeed.
And she added, "We need to carefully consider how we can both use and interrogate digital evidence in court. Ensuring people are protected from miscarriages of justice is vital and one part of the government's plan for change."
Yes, and the MOJ noted that any change requiring the prosecution to prove that any computer device is working correctly could impact the speed at which cases can be completed. Obviously, this is a big concern. And the MOJ said any reform must be well thought out and future-proofed, it said.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I go back to my point about AI. It's going to get a lot more complicated and no doubt sophisticated. And the criminal justice system is going to have to move with that and recognise that AI is going to necessarily impact on digital evidence moving forward. So
exactly.
one to keep an eye on. Now, an important decision on mandatory considerations for public bodies when making decisions on the closure or rearrangement of services has come in the judgment of R. Gould and Jeffrey and Devon County Council. This is a 2025 case, and this will impact on public authority decisions on service closures and rearrangements generally. So given we are facing a tight financial environment, it's an essential judgment to pay attention to. Now bear with me, because the judgment is written in a way that's takes some time to extrapolate, so we'll do our best. But the case concerned the closure of non-statutory drop-in centres in North Devon, and the challenge alleged that a number of the council's wider statutory duties and policies, whilst not said to have been breached, had not been expressly taken into account in the council's decision-making. Now, the court found that the council's decision to close the service was lawful. The council had been under no legal obligation to have regard to specific duties under the Care Act 2014 and other statutory provisions. The judge carefully reviewed the correct approach to when such wider statutory duties and policies constituted mandatory considerations in decision-making, and thus clarified the law in this area. Now, in his judgment, Justice Eyre said that the defendant was right to point out that there is a fundamental difference in public law between a duty to provide benefits or services for a particular individual and a general or target duty which is owed to a whole population. However, the matter of IDAT and in RTS and the London Borough of Hackney, it was held that general or target duties are capable of being relevant factors, with the consequence that it can be a public law error for a decision maker not to take them into account.
Well, indeed, that's right. And here are two key points made by Mr. Justice Eyre in his judgment. If there is a risk that the ultimate decision will involve a breach of a particular duty, then that duty is highly likely to be a material consideration. And he said, conversely, the less likely it is that the ultimate decision will involve such a breach, then the less scope there is for the duty to be a material consideration. And he went on, the decision provided for the closure of the service, but it did so in the context of the assessment that the changes since the service had been established meant that the service's role and the function it performed could and would, if the service closed, be met in other ways. And the closure was not taking place in a vacuum.
Yeah, it's a somewhat complex judgment, which ultimately led to the claim being dismissed. Justice Eyre, concluding, said, important though the lawfulness or otherwise of any decision is, it cannot be said that there were reasons of exceptional public interest which would require the decision to be quashed, even if I had concluded that any failings had not affected the outcome for the claimants. Now, there's a link in the bulletin to this judgment, and I would urge everyone to read it because it is quite important in relation to service provision and any cuts that might necessarily be needed to be taken moving forward by your local authority. Now, from one judgment to another, and this time in the area of licensing. Dennis.
Yes, all licensing lawyers will be interested in this particular item. Here's the question. Can councils insist on a condition to a license requiring the use of ID scanners? The answer is yes. Brighton and Hove City Council have successfully defended its decision to require a city centre pub to use an ID scanner. Molly Malone's is a pub in the heart of Brighton and in the most challenging area of the city's nighttime economy. In 2021, an exceptionally serious incident occurred at the premises in which a 16-year-old gained entry and was subsequently involved in a stabbing and a sexual assault. The premises licence, as you would expect, was revoked in response. An appeal against the revocation was later settled, with new conditions being added to the licence, one of which was a requirement to use ID scanners to scan and record the identity of anyone appearing to be under the age of 30. In 2023, the premises owner, Indigo Leisure Limited, applied to vary the premises licence to remove the ID scanner and other conditions. The council's decision was to maintain the ID scanner condition, noting that it was a vital safeguard for preventing crime and disorder and protecting children from harm. That decision was appealed, and following a hearing in December just gone, the Brighton Magistrates Court has dismissed the premises appeal against the ID scanner condition. Now, among its key findings and conclusions, the court held, first, it found that the ID scanner promoted the crime prevention licensing objective by capturing customer data which could be used by the police to assist their investigations. Second, it held that an ID scanner assists a well-managed team of door supervisors by providing an extra layer of deterrence to people whose behaviour might undermine the licensing objectives. Third and finally, the court rejected the premises argument that the ID scanner condition was obsolete following a government announcement that it plans to legislate for official digital identity documents. In light of the court's decision, Indigo Leisure has agreed to pay the council's costs of the appeal. Well done, Brighton.
Well done indeed. Now, we are always very keen at LLG to ensure that our members look after their mental health and well-being. It's often very easy with the weight of work and balancing our private lives to just keep going without stopping to make sure we're okay. Equally, we might very well be working with a colleague who is suffering greatly, but are unable to offer support or know what to do. The organisation Law Care is an excellent and often unknown body which can provide real and tangible support to legal professionals. Law Care is the mental health charity for the legal sector. They offer free, confidential, emotional support, peer support and information for people working in the legal sector in the UK, the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man. They advocate for improvements in mental health practices within legal workplaces and actively lead cultural transformation through education, training and research. And Law Care also collaborates with legal educators, regulators, professional bodies, special interest groups and legal practices to address the growing body of research that shows how accepted working practices and culture in law undermine mental health. Now, Law Care has launched its new Life in the Law 2025 surveys and invites you to take part. There's two separate surveys. One is for individuals in the legal sector and the other is for organisations such as law firms, chambers, in-house legal departments and of course local authority departments. The surveys are entirely anonymous and take approximately 10 to 15 minutes to fill out.
Indeed, Life in the Law 2025 is a real opportunity to improve mental health in the legal sector. These surveys are open to everyone working in the law, and they'll help us understand why people in our sector may be experiencing poor mental health and what practical steps organisations and individuals can take to prevent this. By sharing your experiences, you're contributing to building a more supportive and healthier working environment for the future. As Law Care says, together we can make a real difference.
Quite so, Dennis, quite so. And on that note, that's it for another edition of the podcast. You can read more on the items discussed today and many more besides by going to bulletin number 4, available on the LLG website now. So it's goodbye from me.
And from me too. Bye now.